Patrick Connor from QueensberryRules.com here with another episode of Boxing with the Beard. This is going to be a recap of the Guillermo Rigondeaux versus Nonito Donaire card for the most part. But there's actually quite a bit of other boxing to get into, but before I get into any of that, I wanted to first address the incident that happened in Boston earlier today. There was a bombing at the Boston Marathon. By now, I'm sure just about anyone who would be watching this has at least read about it, if not heard about it, at a minimum. And on behalf of myself and the rest of the Queensberry Rules team, I wanted to say I'm so sorry to anyone affected, and our heartfelt condolences out to everyone in that area and anyone even remotely affected by it. There's not a whole lot to say that isn't cliches. It's horrible. It's terrible. And I'm very sorry that it happened, and I don't want to dwell too much on the subject, but I felt it needed to be said. So that said, I think that I'll go right into what we saw on Friday Night Fights. Friday night, it wasn't exactly a great Friday Night Fights card. But I think that we've seen this from Friday Night Fights in the last couple of years, where during the season action kind of ebbed and flowed. We got different names, bigger boxing names or kind of big names from yesteryear and stuff like that. But it seemed to be that there was more of a push later in the season to really create good fights, and I don't know if that's going to be the case this season, but in any event, this past Friday night wasn't very good. I think the big name on the card was Rico Ramos. A lot of us are familiar with him because, if I'm not mistaken, he's an Al Haymon fighter. We've seen him a lot on television, and he was being kind of pushed a little bit in terms of being a viable prospect / contender a couple of years back. Wound up actually losing to Guillermo Rigondeaux, and he's now he's lost in his last 4 fights, he's lost 3 of those fights. And so I think that we kind of saw why on Friday night. A lot of guys that I know, myself included, believed that he was kind of overrated in a way. He was being pushed as a big power puncher, and I think that against Oscar Gonzalez on Friday night, we saw that he's not the type of puncher that will carry his power up a division. And basically, he looked pretty good early on. Gonzalez wound up knocking him down with a body shot in the 6th round, and then from there, Ramos just kind of looked to survive. He looked like a guy that wasn't really into winning the fight, and that wasn't really a surprise to a lot of people, I think. But regardless, it's kind of tough to say where either of those guys go from now. From this point forward. Ramos, I don't really want to see on too many main events from this point forward, just because he's already been pushed in main events or even co-features in the past and hasn't really delivered on a whole lot of action, except for maybe 1 or 2 fights tops. And Gonzalez, no disrespect to the guy, but I didn't see a whole lot special from him. He basically just kept on relatively steady pressure, and that was enough to win the fight, a decent body attack, and that was that. And on the undercard, I think that maybe the most notable other thing that happened in terms of news was that Oscar Molina, who is Carlos and Javier Molina's brother, he wound up stopping Daryl Gardner in the 1st round of their fight. It was kind of a walkover, and it's not surprising. Oscar is 4-0. It was his 4th fight. It's not like he was coming in with a whole lot of experience, so they're going to look to get a guy like that, a 2012 Olympian. They're going to look to get him wins and get him experience. He didn't exactly get too many rounds, and obviously it was a 1st round KO, but I thought he showed some pretty nice body work. He went in on a guy that obviously he didn't really look like he was going to be standing up to a whole lot of punishment, and he didn't. But Molina did the right thing, and he went to the body steadily, and then wound up knocking him down twice. The first time on a right hand, the second time on a hook, and that was it. I think also kind of a quirky or funny thing that happened during that fight was that Gardner wound up having to come into the ring with another fighter from the untelevised undercard's bloody trunks because his trunks had split or something like that. And I think that I guess I'll just take that moment to say that he was probably making, my guess would be no more than about $1,000 for that fight, and a lot of guys don't, a lot of fans and a lot of boxing folks don't understand that if a guy's making $1,000 for a fight, he's probably spending a good chunk of that just on training expenses, and maybe even traveling expenses, depending on what type of deal he cut with the opponent for traveling expenses or whatever other type of expenses. So it's kind of a rough road, and I think that bloody trunks thing just kind of points to that he definitely didn't seem to be coming in to win, but a lot of these guys have to make a living a pretty tough way, but that's kind of what it is. The world needs ditch diggers as well as superstars, and unfortunately he falls into the former category, at least for now. And also on the undercard, the kind of sandwich fight, the in-between fight, was Ray Lampkin Jr. versus Landon Horseman. That was actually a kind of decent little 3-round fight. It wasn't high on in skill or championship caliber stuff, but it wasn't bad. Horseman was kind of a gangly, almost 6 foot, type of awkward character, versus Ray Lampkin Jr., who a lot of people of this generation might remember. Ray Lampkin Sr. was a guy who took on Roberto Duran, and he got TKO'd in, I think, the 14th round, if I'm not mistaken. And that's kind of his claim to fame. Unfortunately, that's about as far as he went. But Lampkin Jr., he looked to have some decent hand speed, a little bit of style and whatnot, but if I'm not mistaken, he's 29 years old. It was only his 3rd fight, and he got knocked down solidly. He didn't seem to be hurt, but he got knocked down a bit by a right hand, kind of an awkward right hand from Horseman in the 2nd round, but he came back pretty good to probably take the end of that round and maybe even make it and instead of a 10-8 type of round, a 10-9 type of round. And then, of course, he came back in the following round to stop Horseman, just kind of on volume. He just basically attacked, and Horseman had no answer for it. It looked there for a minute in the 2nd round like Horseman might get him, but it wasn't to be. Horseman is a fairly uncoordinated character. He seemed to have a bit of a story behind him, as he's a Native American fighter, and there aren't too many successful Native American fighters around, but that story wasn't going to be enough to get him through that fight, and it wasn't. And that basically rounded out the Friday Night Fights broadcast. Between those 3 fights, the actual broadcast time wound up being just over an hour. So I think that that's also a good time to bring up the fact that we wound up having to wait for, I'm not sure how long, 25, 30 minutes, because NASCAR ran late. So we wound up having to wait until like 8:40 or something like that until the first fight started. And for people on the East Coast, that's pretty brutal. That's 11:40 at night. You have to wait to see the first fight. That's it's kind of rough. And I think that if we have fight cards like this, you can't really complain that we're having to wait for NASCAR to end to put those on. It wasn't exactly a fight card worthy of rushing, onto the air, and that's stuff like Just for Men and other Cialis type commercials being sponsors. That kind of says it all in terms of how important the network thinks we are, as far as boxing fans and bringing boxing to the forefront. And from what I know, the ratings have been fairly consistent overall if you look at Friday Night Fights as a show. But, keep putting on cards like this and they won't be. They're going to go down. But it is what it is, I suppose, as far as being a boxing fan, because that's kind of what we've come to expect. We're the redheaded stepchildren of sports fans and have to accept being, put in the back row, as it were. Also on Friday night was Showbox on Showtime. That was a slightly more interesting card than Friday Night Fights, but it also ran just over an hour. The main fight was Bahodir Mamajinov. A little bit of a long name, apologize. And Angelo Santana. It wound up being an upset in favor of Mamajinov. He was brought in late notice as a substitute, and he wound up scoring a TKO in 9 rounds over Santana, who was kind of billed as a bit of a power puncher, a Cuban guy who also himself had a bit of a story. He had defected after having over 180 amateur fights. He defected from Cuba with a makeshift boat to try and reunite with some of his family, who did, I believe, wind up escaping to the United States. And the Cuban government was reluctant to put him in any international competitions as an amateur because some of his relatives had already defected from Cuba. And so I guess they feared that he would also defect, and of course he did wind up defecting. He was, I want to say, 11-0 with 9 knockouts or something like that coming into the fight. Perhaps 9-0. I'm sorry, I don't remember specifically, but regardless, he was undefeated. He was fairly highly touted, even though he didn't have a real great record. He wound up scoring a knockdown basically on a jab, as Mamajinov was a bit off balance in the second round, and that was about the extent of his success in that fight, actually. He didn't wind up doing a whole lot after that, not really that much significant anyways. Mamajinov, his only loss is to Darley Perez, who's going to be fighting Yuriorkis Gamboa fairly soon, and he came into the fight, I think that he wasn't really brought in expected to win, and it was being tabbed as an upset for a reason. He wound up just basically breaking down Santana with kind of slow, laid back pressure almost, because he was outboxing Santana for much of the fight, but then it just wound up becoming a little bit too much. He knocked Santana down with body shots in the 8th round, just kind of overwhelming, rough body shots in the 8th round. And then in the 9th round, Santana was he was just about done already, and it didn't take a whole lot to put him down. And he went down the first time from a right hand, got up, went down from a left hand, and that was the end of the fight, and rightfully so. So that wound up being an upset in the main event of Showbox. And then in the co-main, just underneath, was Amir Imam stopping Jeremy Bryan in the second round. It was a pretty nasty knockout. Bryan went down hard, smacked his head on the canvas, and was absolutely unconscious. But the problem is that Imam, his opposition, just isn't very good. Bryan included. His style was kind of weird. He's a little gangly, awkward delivery, but that was about all he had going for him, and he wound up getting knocked out pretty badly anyway. But it was a pretty nasty KO, and that was about it. It was a 1-2 punch, got him with the right hand, flattened, and that was Showbox. I always, well, not always, but generally enjoy Showbox because they tend to match guys that are early in their careers, or either are unbeaten or haven't lost a whole lot. And I think that creates an atmosphere where these guys are forced to think in a way where they might not think when they're being cradled and brought up soft by promotional companies. And it brings up hungry contenders, at least it seems to, and that's, I think, what we're looking for as fight fans. And so I'll continue to support Showbox as long as they put on decent cards, even if the action isn't always spectacular. As long as they're matching younger guys that are willing to work, I'm fine with that, and I'll continue to support them. Of course, the big news was Guillermo Rigondeaux beating Nonito Donaire. But before I get into that, I'd also just like to quickly mention that the baby bull, Juan Diaz, made a comeback this weekend as well. He hadn't fought in almost 3 years, and so it's pretty significant, I suppose. I was always a fan of his personally, for no other reason than he just gets in there and throws punches. He puts his head down and throws punches, and he was always willing to fight the best in his heyday, as it were. And I don't really see how someone couldn't be a fan of that. He gets in there, throws punches, and sees what happens. And he wound up taking out Pepino Cuevas Jr. So, I mean, it's significant that he made a comeback, but Pepino Cuevas Jr. is not a significant opponent. He was something like 3-7 in his last 10 fights coming in, all 7 losses by stoppage. So that's not impressive stuff. But the point is that Diaz had to get back in, get a win, get a couple rounds in, and he did. He TKO'd him in the 6th round. He looked pretty decent. But he looked about the same as before. He had wound up dropping out of the game, saying that he was going to focus on his studies, which were, talked about quite a bit when he was around. He was in law school. I can't remember what type of law he was looking to practice, but he was in law school, and he retired basically to focus on law school. And like so many other fighters, he got the itch to come back, and he did. So, in any event, I don't think that he looked bad, but I am kind of reluctant to totally buy the comeback attempt as legitimate because, he went out and he seemed happy when he did. He seemed content with his career when he did, and I don't really think that he has a whole lot more to prove. And on top of that, his style is the type of style that's going to get him hit. He always got hit. He just seemed to have a pretty decent chin and a little bit more, if not more firepower, just more energy and more stamina than other guys. And I don't know how well that's going to hold up at this point. I hope for his sake it does. And also I hope as a fan that it does, because like I said, I think he's fun to watch. But I am skeptical. I'm not going to totally buy into it quite yet. But we'll see what happens. I don't see him... I don't know about 135 pounds because it's not a very... competitive division right now, and I've always thought that he could make 130 pounds. 140 pounds just really isn't an option for him right now. The depth of that class it's too much. I don't see him competing against a whole lot of guys there, and in any event, good luck to him. The undercard of the Guillermo Rigondeaux versus Nonito Donaire fight, the top rank televised undercard. Most of it was televised on the Top Rank website, as it usually is. And many of the fights were kind of showcase type bouts where guys were, basically winning easily. And I don't really have a big problem with that when the main event is something like Rigondeaux versus Donaire. But just to kind of rattle off a couple, because I'm not going to go through every fight individually, and also because most of them, in my opinion, weren't super significant in terms of opposition. Sean Monahan, Jesse Hart, and Mikhail Zuski wound up scoring stoppage wins over basically overmatched foes. And also Glenn Tapia wound up winning a decision. Sorry, loud car outside. Glenn Tapia wound up winning a decision against, now I can't even remember his name, even though I was reading up on it. I watched it and was reading up on it before I did this report, but he wound up winning a decision, and then also Tyler Canning wound up winning a decision that a lot of people, including myself, was questionable over. Dairo Sochia, I believe his name was pronounced. And that was actually a pretty decent fight. It was a little 4-round fight. They were scrapping pretty nicely, but it looked like, to me, that Sochi had landed the more telling shots. I'm not going to argue too much in a 4-round fight between guys that aren't super high caliber, but I didn't know that the decision was that great. In any event, I think that aside from what I just mentioned, the most notable thing that happened on the undercard was Felix Verdejo, who was a 2012 Olympian for Puerto Rico. He fought his 5th fight and scored a pretty nice TKO in the first round over Steve Gutierrez. He really has a couple mean right hands on him. I'll tell you that much. He can toss some pretty gnarly right hands. Basically, Gutierrez was coming off 2 losses, so take the win with a grain of salt. But it was only Verdejo's 5th fight. You can't really, be too harsh on a guy that's coming up at that point. Although Verdejo, he does have experience, and it's not like he had no amateur fights or anything like that. But he looks promising to me. He looks like he could have something on him. He was composed. He was not really following Gutierrez around the ring, but just cutting it off and being fairly vicious about it. So I appreciate that type of style, and I love it. And I'm going to be looking at that guy. And then, of course, the big news of the weekend was Guillermo Rigondeaux upsetting Nonito Donaire at Radio City Music Hall in New York City. Already, there's been a lot discussed about the fight. I've discussed my opinion on Twitter and Facebook about the fight already, but it bears, a lot of it bears repeating, I think. First of all, I did pick Nonito to win the fight beforehand. I am sorry I didn't do a preview video, but it was a busy week. But regardless, I did pick Nonito I thought it would be either a relatively close decision or a later round stoppage, just because I thought that he was the quality guy coming in. He had fought better opponents. I thought that he had just kind of proven himself more than Rigondeaux had, and I wound up being very wrong. A lot of us wound up being very wrong. I think that Rigondeaux, he put on basically an exhibition. I think that I'll put it this way because I don't want to get too caught up into going down different little branches of the discussion and arguments. But I thought that it was obviously a combination of, number one, Rigondeaux maybe being a bit better than many of us realized. Number two, he applied his skills and his amateur experience, his overall experience towards the fight, and he executed well. And on top of that, I think that the other 2 factors were that, on the side of that number one, that we've seen a number of times before that Nonito Donaire had problems with counterpunchers or guys who weren't really engaging him. For example, in spots against Nishioka, it might not have been that Nonito was losing rounds, but he just didn't look very good. It wasn't a very pleasing fight to watch. Again, against Omar Narvaez, a lot of people weren't very familiar with Narvaez coming into that fight, but I had actually known about him for a couple of years because I had been trading fights on the internet with a couple guys who had really good quality video of him. So I knew of him, and I thought that he would give Nonito some trouble, but I didn't know that it was going to be to the level that it was. And in that fight, it wasn't so much that Narvaez was giving Nonito trouble, but it was just that his really reactionary, kind of skippy, twitchy style made it really difficult for Nonito to advance with any type of confidence. And on top of that, as a natural counterpuncher, I think that Nonito doesn't prefer to go after guys. He would prefer a guy to come to him so that he could counter the hell out of him with speed, which is what he's good at. But in any event, I think that there have been a couple other fights where that it's shown that he's not very good at adjusting to when guys try to counterpunch him or make him lead. And then I think the last factor is the fact that a lot of mention was put into Nonito probably not having the best training camp. And then he came up after the fight and said that he had a shoulder injury. I'll just kind of go into that really briefly. I really have no indication that a shoulder injury would be not legit. I have no reason to not believe Nonito when he says that. And it's not totally uncommon for guys to fight hurt or even badly injured, even just for fear of losing a payday or being inactive. So I have no reason to doubt that. And if that is true, it probably did play a role in the fight. But even, kind of stripping away those factors individually, I think that the bottom line was that Rigondeaux pulled the trigger and was the quicker fighter, was the more nimble fighter, and basically just had the better game plan, while Nonito had almost none. His game plan looked to be that he was going to try to knock Rigondeaux out, and if that didn't happen, that he didn't know what he was going to do. And that's what it looked like to me, because he landed in the first round. It wound up being a pretty decent round. I know a lot of people are talking about how boring the fight was. The first couple of rounds to me were fun to watch, especially the first round where they both landed some pretty gnarly shots on each other. And looked from there, I thought that it was going to be a firefight, and that's what it looked like in the first round. But Donaire wound up landing a couple of left hands just even in the first round, and he was the one who wound up getting kind of staggered backwards. And I don't know that I would say that was the point in the fight where he lost or anything like that, but it looked to me like he was looking as though Rigondeaux was going to fall with some of those shots, and when he didn't know what to do. From then on out, I had trouble giving Nonito very many rounds. I wound up scoring at 10-2. Of course, Nonito scored a knockdown in the 10th round, and that was a pretty tricky shot. I don't think that Rigondeaux was so much hurt as he was surprised, because they were kind of coming out of a clinch. Rigondeaux looked like his feet weren't really set, and then he got popped with a left hand from a guy who can punch, and he went down, got up, I think at the count of like 2, and in my opinion, he wound up surviving for the next, maybe couple sequences of punches, and then wound up taking the rest of the round, in my opinion, very clearly, and then had a huge 12th round that on my card was on the verge of being a 10-8 round, because Nonito threw very few punches, and I don't even know if he was credited with landing any. He probably was, but there was nothing significant going on there. So in any event, so much of the post-fight discussion has been about the fact that the fight was so boring. Already Bob Arum is coming out and saying that it's going to be a challenge to promote Rigondeaux. He doesn't like his style and stuff like that. And now I just want to, take a couple minutes to talk about that, I suppose. And that's that, first of all, I'll admit that I enjoyed the fight. I didn't really have a huge problem with Rigondeaux's style or the way that he conducted himself. I didn't think it was terrible. There wasn't a ton of clinching. He wasn't fouling. He basically was just leading a guy around the ring who looked as if he had no problem being led around the ring, because he did very little about it. So I think that you can't just say, I don't like Rigondeaux's style based on this fight, because so much of the lack of action, I think the responsibility also has to be put on to Nonito Donaire, because he did very little about the lack of action. His corner kept asking him to pick it up, throw punches, work off the jab, all these types of things, and he did none of them. How much of that has to do with his training or the injury, I don't know. But the problem is, at this point, that doesn't really matter. He could have done anything, even just picking up the activity a little bit more. I think that the argument against that was that he just would have gotten countered. But if you refuse to pick up your activity, it doesn't matter, because there's no chance there, period. So basically, I thought that it was a superb performance from Rigondeaux. I think that both guys will come back. Nonito, to me, looked a little bit flat. He didn't really look like the same type of fighter that we've seen in the past. And of course that had something to do with Rigondeaux being on a different level than so many of the guys that he's fought recently. But at the same time, I think that Nonito did look a little different than we normally see him, and I would expect him to come back myself. I've become a little bit of a fan in the last year or two, and I would like to see him come back and do well. Rigondeaux, it's really tough to say what options are out there for him. With Abner Mares being at Golden Boy Promotions, it's just such a shame that we wound up just having to